Welcome to the webinar, everyone. Here we are, another wonderful afternoon where we have an opportunity to learn a few things, an opportunity to get some information that we might not have otherwise had, and an opportunity to get some information that we can share with the people that we care about and we love. This is Mark Bennett, COO of ID Life, wanting to share with you a little bit of how to simplify things, because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. Today's topic: what's making America fat? You know, it's an interesting question. Actually, it's an interesting statement because the answer is misconstrued and misunderstood. And you're going to see today what I mean by that. But most importantly, what you're going to see is that it's not necessarily what you think it is. You know, in order to really appreciate and understand the topic today, I start with this. You don't have to think outside the box. You just have to think like there is no box. Sometimes we have to forget what we think we know in order to actually learn something. You know, I've had a lot of mentors in my life, but I always like to revert back to one of the greatest mentors I've ever had, which was my grandmother and my grandfather, whose little sayings meant very little to me when I was a child. But as I reflect back, you know, in their third and fourth grade educations combined, are guiding principles of my life today. And one of the things my grandmother used to tell me, because I loved to talk as a child, imagine that, was that, Mark, you're never going to learn anything talking. You're only going to learn when you listen. So sometimes we can't be the person that knows everything. Sometimes we have to listen. And the biggest question, or the most important question you can always ask when you're trying to learn something, is why? Why is the most powerful question. In fact, if you look at this, what do you see? Do you see a beautiful young girl, or do you see an old hag? See, if you look at it one way, in fact, if you look at what appears to be the upper dark part that looks like a hat, and then you go down the left-hand side, you see the little nose and you see the eyelashes. Now you see a beautiful girl. Now, for some of you, you were like, hold on a second, I saw an old woman. For those of you that saw the beautiful girl away and didn't see the old woman, go down to what you think is the beautiful young lady's chin, make that a nose, and work backwards, and you'll see the old hag. See, sometimes our perception is what skews our reality. In fact, Einstein said it best: education is what remains after one has forgotten what one has learned in school. So now that we've established this, we've set it up, we got people, you know, primed, ready to learn. Here is something that you need to know. Calories are not making Americans fat. Wow. Okay, that's a very bold statement, but the reality is calories are not making Americans fat. They just aren't. That's not what's happening. And some of you right now are like, okay, wait, what? I thought this was a whole calorie counting thing. In fact, you know, 98% of diets fail. Most of those diets fail because people spend all day, every day, trying to count those calories. We're going to show you today why that's not necessarily working for anyone. See, in 1977, we began this shift in America to a diet low fat. In fact, it was called the Eat Less, Move More approach to health. There's a lot of reasons why this happened. This became kind of the government's guideline, the food pyramid guideline. Basically, it was, look, America, if you want to get back to health, it's simple. You just need to eat less, and you need to get out and move more. In fact, there's some people that still follow this principle. I mean, it's everywhere. You know, and it was basically a calorie is a calorie, and here's your calorie burn and all the other aspects of things. And you need the calorie deficit. Unfortunately, since 1977, we've also gotten a lot of these wonderful foods that you see with these types of labels everywhere. The fat freeze, the sugar freeze, the low calorie, you know, all of these different labels out there that we still see today and that we rely on when we're making healthy choices, healthy purchases. And we think these are the things that are going to get us where we want. Well, as they say, documentation beats conversation. So let's look at the documentation. Since 1977, when we started this wonderful Eat Less, Move More approach, what has happened to the obesity rate in America? Well, I won't say it's a hockey stick, but it is a gradual increase. Some would say it's a massive increase. But it's a percent of people with a BMI over 30. So think about that for a second. In 1977, when we started this, it was a little less than 20. Now we're at over 40% of people with a BMI over 30 that are ages 45 to 64. But look at that 18 to 29 range. They went from less than 10% to now almost 30%. These are the children of our world. These are the kids with just a children. In fact, if you want to actually talk about children, 1977 to 2000, childhood obesity has more than doubled in ages 6 to 11, tripled in ages 12 to 19. And obesity-related diseases have become so common that America has eliminated adult onset diabetes as a medical term. Now, there may be some people on this webinar that don't even know the term adult onset diabetes. See, this is what we used to refer to as type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes was something that you got in adulthood based upon the diet that you chose or the lifestyle that you chose. It was never something that happened in children, but now it is running rampant in our kids. And so much so that we dropped the adult onset explanation, and now we just call it type 2. So eat less, move more. You know, it's a very bold statement that doesn't work. How do we know it doesn't work? Okay. I mean, this is something that is still preached. This is still something that is part of the government guidelines on the food pyramid. You know, how do we know that this doesn't work? You know, that's a very bold statement. Well, there have been two major studies done. One was called the Women's Health Initiative Study. It was put out by the National Institute of Health in 2006. And here's what happened. They published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and hundreds of millions were spent on this study. I want to repeat this. Hundreds of millions of dollars, tax dollars, you paid for this, were spent on this study to prove Eat Less, Move More works. 50,000 women were included in the study. Okay, so this wasn't a small study. This was a big one. This was done over a 7.5-year period. Reduced calories by 30%, increased carbs, fruits, vegetables, and grains, and increased exercise by roughly 14%. So took all of these participants and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to reduce your calories by 30%. You're going to eat 30% less, eat less. Okay, increased carbs, fruits, vegetables, and grains. So in other words, fit within the food pyramid of what we're recommending on the government food pyramid. And we increased exercise by 14%. So eat less and we moved more. What happened? Well, the results showed a 13% reduction in metabolism. In other words, metabolism went down, not up. So this eat less, move more resulted in a slower metabolism for folks on average, and no weight difference between the do nothing group and the study group. So they had two groups of these 50,000. One just did what they always did. They didn't change anything. In other words, it was the do nothing group. That was the baseline group. And the other was the study group that did all of these reductions and counted their calories and increased their exercise. There was absolutely no weight difference between the two groups. And unfortunately, what happened was waist circumference was also the same. So in other words, after 7.5 years of study and people, you know, basically limiting what they ate and increasing what they did and eating a very specific diet for a long period of time, we find after hundreds of millions of dollars studied that there is absolutely no change between doing nothing and doing eat less, move more. Okay, so here's one study, but is that really it? I mean, is that all we rely on when we say eat less, move more doesn't work? Well, we then looked at the health study because, you know, hey, look, you know, in America, if you don't get the result you want one time, let's go do it again. Let's spend some more money. New England Journal of Medicine is where this was published in 2010. This was schools. This was kids. Okay, well, you know, maybe it's just adults. Maybe, you know, as adults get older, their metabolism slows naturally. So maybe that's what caused all this result. Maybe, you know, we need to go to children. So this was 42 different schools, over 4,600 kids, grades 6 to 8. So that's what this study was. Okay. Half of the kids got a low calorie, low fat diet along with increased exercise. So in other words, eat less, move more. That's what half of them got. Okay. The others did nothing. At the end of 3 years, both the do nothing group and the eat less, move more group had reduced their obesity rates by 50% to 45%. I'm going to let that set in for just a second. So half got low calories, low fat. So children for a 3-year period did the eat less, do more. You know, that's kind of the concept that we have here. And both the do nothing group, kids that just were kids and ate the way that they ate and did what they always did, the obesity rate in those children, in that sample group, went from 50% to 45% in both groups. So what do we know? Eat less, move more is an absolute failure. It doesn't work. Okay, so if this is your plan and this is what you're trying to do, is if what you're trying to do to, your New Year's resolutions every year is, I'm just going to eat less and I'm just going to move more. I'm going to go join a gym and, that gym's going to fix everything. Well, here's the secret. You're never going to out-train a bad diet. Okay, you're just not. And eating less isn't the answer, because at the end of the day, it's not quantity, it's quality of the food that you're consuming. That's the big key here. That's why these programs don't work, but I want to make sure everyone understands that. So let's look at some of the other contributing factors. 1 soda a day increases a child's chance of obesity by 60%. Okay, 60%, 1 soda a day. Okay, so I know that right now I'm touching a sensitive topic for a lot of people, but I just want to make sure people have the stats. But here's the thing, there's no fat in soda. People still have this mindset of fat makes you fat. The reality is there's no fat in soda, but there is a direct correlation between 1 soda a day and your increased chance of obesity. Okay, so just know that. How about this one? Overweight kids are more likely to be overweight adults. Imagine what that percentage is. It's 80%. Overweight kids are 80% more likely to be overweight adults. Our metabolisms, our bone structure, our muscle structure, all of this occurs when we are children. If we're allowing this to happen in our kids, guess what? They're going to struggle with this their entire life. And of course, obese children are 17 times more likely to develop diabetes in adulthood. This is why we're starting to see the uptick of diabetes running roughshod in our children, so much so that we had to drop the term adult onset diabetes. Now, how is this happening in our kids? Well, empty calories from added sugars and solid fats make up 40% of our kids' diets. This is your processed foods. These are your things in your bags, boxes, jars, and cans. Those added sugars and solid fats that are put into that processed food and fast food, etc., that make up a majority of the things that they consume, that's 40% of their diet on a daily basis. 50% of those calories are coming from these things right here: sodas, juices, pizzas, ice cream, pastries, and milk. That's where it's coming from, 50% of it. As somebody who had a daughter who basically thought her first 5 years of life, all she was going to eat is chicken and French fries, this is hard to look at. But at the same time, you have to understand that with knowledge comes power. With knowledge, you can make changes. And that's what this is about. That's what these lunch and learns are about, is making people understand that these small little things that we're doing out of convenience because, hey, we don't have time, sometimes we're costing ourselves time on this earth as a result of that excuse. How about this? Food additives, these wonderful things that we put into processed foods, receive 30 times more federal subsidies than unprocessed carbs, in other words, fruits and vegetables. Think about that. All these chemicals, genetic modification, all these things, 30 times more federal subsidies than unprocessed carbs. We are literally subsidizing the thing that is killing us. We just are. Now, with all these studies, with all this information, we now have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to learn that eat less, move more does not work. We know it. We have proof of it. But what happens if I go over to choosemyplate.gov, the guidelines right now for Americans on how to eat? What am I going to see? Well, what you're going to see is this right here. This is your healthy eating style. Okay, so let's look at these. Make half your plate fruits and vegetables. And that's actually a great recommendation. We say make your plate colorful. In fact, if most Americans did that right now, half their plate fruits and vegetables and put whatever else they wanted on the other half of the plate, most people would not have the obesity issue that they have today. They just wouldn't. Focus on whole fruits. Vary your veggies. All great advice. Vary your protein routine. Absolutely great advice. But guess what? We still have some problems. In fact, if you look at make half your grains, whole grains, well, okay, but that's question mark because there's a lot of reasons why. Move to low fat and fat-free milk. And we've talked about fat. Fat doesn't make you fat. We've proven that not to be the case, but yet that's still in our guidelines. And then, of course, drink and eat less sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars. Well, the less sodium and added sugars agree with, but saturated fat has been proven that maybe that advice isn't the greatest. So even though we have studies to prove all of these various things, and we have science that we spent hundreds of millions of dollars on to disprove some of these theories, they are still part of the vernacular of what our government is telling us we should do. Calories are not making us fat. Hands down, we know that. What is? Okay, we've established the fact that calories are not making us fat, but what is making us fat? Here's the secret answer. It's insulin. Insulin is making Americans fat. Now, some of you are like, well, hold on, insulin's that stuff you put into yourself when you get type 2 diabetes. No, your body naturally produces insulin. Okay, it naturally produces it. Some people do have to add it, and we're going to talk about that as well. But insulin is the key. So first, in order to understand why insulin is making us fat, we need to understand what insulin is. So what is it? Insulin is a hormone that regulates the levels of glucose in the blood, that's sugar in the blood. So another name for this is blood sugar. The hormone works by helping the body's cells to absorb that sugar. Insulin causes weight gain when the cells absorb too much glucose or sugar, and the body converts this into fat. Now, I keep saying glucose, sugar, but guess what? There's a lot of different forms, okay? So just need to know that. So in order to understand what we're talking about, all right, we have to back things up, okay? We have to really rewind and say, okay, I now know that insulin is making Americans fat, but how does insulin happen? How do I get insulin into my bloodstream? What's occurring here? Well, we can look at this wonderful little thing, okay, sugar. And sugar is the easy culprit. You can basically blame sugar for a lot of things, and there's reasons why people blame sugar for a lot of things. But people need to understand when the word sugar is used, it's almost like saying fats are bad for you or carbs are bad for you. If you don't understand, there's a good thing between good fats and bad fats, and the different types, and carbs, good carbs and bad carbs. In fact, when we're talking about carbs, what we're talking about is simple carbs versus complex carbs. And there's a huge difference between the two of them. Okay. And another way of looking at this, when you're talking about simple carbs versus complex carbs, is simple sugars versus starches. See, starches convert to sugar in the body. That's a different type of sugar. Our body deals with that differently. And we're going to learn about that in just a second. But you also have simple sugars. Our body deals with that differently as well. Okay. But the simple sugars is the largest culprit here. Though if you have insulin problems because of things that you've done, you very well may have a problem with some of the starches as well. So just know that. Another way to look at this is glucose and fructose. Okay, glucose is your good sugars, fructose is your bad sugar. Okay, and I'm trying to educate people here, because I will tell you that a lot of people think fructose is their friend because fructose sounds like fruit, and fruit must be okay because fructose must be okay because it sounds like fruit. I can only tell you that it must be confusing for people that fruit actually has the glucose, some forms of fructose as well, but that's a different discussion for a different day. But for the most part, has glucose, and our body knows what to do with those natural sugars. And then you have your processed sweets, that's fructose, that's your bad sugars. Now you also have something called sucrose. Okay, Mark, you're getting really sciencey on us. What in the world is sucrose now that we're trying to find out what glucose and all these other things are? Well, sucrose is a combination, 50-50 combination of glucose and fructose. Another way of calling sucrose is your table sugar. This is that white refined powder that you find all over the place. Every restaurant has it for every drink you want to put in it, as well as it's all over our houses for things that we want to add things to, as well as in every processed thing that we eat, including things that come in bags from a window into your car. But then we decided, you know what, sucrose just wasn't sweet enough. We need to come up with something new. The food industry was more than willing to oblige because it was a lot cheaper. And that's what we call high fructose corn syrup. That's 45% glucose, 55% fructose. In other words, 45% of the good sugar, if you will, and 55% of the bad sugars. So how does this actually work? Okay, we eat something that is a combination of both. How does our body process? Well, let's look at it a different way. So you eat food with carbohydrates, because remember, carbohydrates convert to sugar in the blood. Okay, they are a combination of glucose and fructose. So carbs change to sugar, glucose after digestion. So part of it is glucose. The fructose portion heads to the liver, and 30% is automatically converted to fat. So let's stop there. All right. So the glucose is, it's part of it. The fructose is basically 30% automatically turning to fat right out of the gate. You see when we said glucose is the good sugar, fructose the bad sugar, because we know that when we consume fructose, 30% of it or more is immediately going to be converted to fat. Okay, now we're headed down the path. We have glucose and fructose in the body. What happens to the glucose? We stay on top. Glucose enters the blood to go to all the different parts of the body for energy. Okay, great. We're going to get energy from the glucose. Understand. The fructose, though, enters the liver and converts to triglycerides. Another word for triglycerides is fats. Some stays in the liver, turning into fatty liver. The others enters the bloodstream. So think about that. If you have a fatty liver, and you can look up all the different diagnoses and problems with fatty liver and what that results from. But basically, that's too much fructose being processed in the liver. All right, so next phase. All right, now we're moving on. Your pancreas senses the rise in blood sugar on the top because of the glucose, and that produces insulin. All right, so the glucose creates insulin in the body. Fructose does not. Okay, so think about this for a second. The body is designed to basically have a defense system, insulin, to go into the bloodstream to take care of glucose. In other words, convert it to energy, use it, store it as energy, and take care of getting the glucose out of the body. As for fructose, we're converting it to fats. So all of the fructose doesn't have the same aspects of things. In fact, there's not even an insulin response to fructose. That's why fructose is the bad sugar. All fructose is going to be converted to fats or fat in the bloodstream. Okay, and in fact, those triglycerides, if you look on, those fats are stored in fat cells. So when we're eating fructose, we're basically just storing up our fat cells and giving them more food to stick around for a longer period of time. Okay, so just know that. And of course, that insulin helps the sugar get into the cells in your body so that they can use the sugar as energy. Still doesn't mean that, you load it up with glucose, but it does mean that, the body was designed to do something with glucose and take care of glucose and convert it to energy. With regard to fructose, it was designed to basically create and store fat with it. Another way of looking at it is this way, okay? While glucose is processed into energy or stored as glycogen in the liver and muscles for later use as energy, fructose is metabolized into fat. In other words, abdominal fat. Know anybody that has the little table that they carry around with them that they call their belly, that they could, put a can on or a bottle on and hold it? Okay, a lot of that is fructose based. Okay, that's where a lot of that abdominal fat comes from, that visceral fat that gets around our body's organs and tissues. That is a big issue for us. In fact, if you look at the top, if you eat 120 calories of glucose, okay, that's your good sugars again, 1 calorie is converted to fat. Think about that. But if you eat 120 calories of fructose, by the time it's metabolized, processed through the liver and everything else, 40 calories are converted to fat. Now you see why fructose, bad sugar, glucose, the good sugar, if there is such a thing as good sugar. Because remember, insulin is what is making us fat. And I'm talking about the good sugars are the only thing that produce insulin. So now we get to this glycemic index. Let's talk about this for half a second. The glycemic index is a great guide for you to make food choice changes, okay? Food choice changes from what you're currently doing to something that is lower on the glycemic index. In other words, making a conversion. The whole idea behind the glycemic index was moving people away from high fructose foods to foods that were higher in the glucose category, okay? All carbs, okay, or at least a combination of carbs and other things, because they may, there are such foods as carbs with proteins and carbs with fats, etc. So I'm not going to get into that today. But realize the whole idea behind this was to move people to carbohydrates that were more in the glucose category, less in the fructose category. But here's the problem. What it was designed to do and how people use it are two totally different things. In fact, most people that try to live and die by the glycemic index, they get paralysis by analysis. Just telling you the truth. I mean, you can't live there because trying to figure all that out, I mean, literally it's in some respects more cumbersome than calorie counting. The best thing that you can do is make better quality food choices instead of the quantity, aspect of things. Pick foods that are natural or have naturally occurring sugars rather than added processed refined sugars. Okay, it really is moving to something more simple like that, as opposed to trying to overcomplicate things. In fact, if we look at glucose versus fructose another way, glucose, the primary source of energy, okay, that's 80% of glucose is absorbed by the intestines, only 20% by the liver. Okay, so it doesn't have as much strain on the liver as fructose does. Glucose does not turn into fat. 80% is burned directly in the cells, and 20% being stored as glycogen, in other words, energy for later use. It's cholesterol friendly. Virtually none of your glucose consumption is converted to bad cholesterol. Okay, so when a lot of people are looking at sugars and they have the cholesterol, and the doctor says, you need to stay away from sugars, and people cut out, fruits and things like that, just remember the glucose type items don't convert to cholesterol, especially bad cholesterol. And of course, normal leptin and insulin response. When we eat glucose, like fruits, type things that are mainly glucose, our body knows what to do with those, and our body has a leptin response. That's our full response, and a natural insulin response, which is insulin goes in, converts it to glycogen and or uses it as energy. But the fructose doesn't have the same thing. See, fructose, when we consume that, those processed refined sugars, it's a toxic time bomb. Fructose can only be processed by the body's filtration system, or the liver. That's our filtration system. Fructose makes you fat because 30% is converted to fat right away. The rest is going into our fat cells in the form of triglycerides. It promotes bad cholesterol because 30% of all fructose is immediately converted to bad cholesterol. So those with high cholesterol, fructose is your enemy. And it does not stimulate a leptin insulin response. Now think about that. Fructose does not have your leptin receptor. In other words, I'm full receptor sending signals to the brain saying stop eating. That's why we can overeat these processed sugar things so easily and just feel absolutely stuffed with them, because guess what? Our body doesn't know to send the signal to the brain that we're full, because most of the times when we're going for fructose, it's addictive related. In other words, it's a dopamine desire. It's not a hunger desire. So think about that for a second. Glucose is usually associated with hunger. Fructose is usually associated with desire, addiction, or dopamine. So just remember those differences. Also, when we look at the process, this is another way of looking at it. Fructose, it's the liver, some stays in the liver, and other goes into triglycerides in the blood. With regard to glucose, goes to the liver, and then of course the pancreas produces insulin to take it out. Now, how does the insulin work? Well, this is it. See, we have this insulin receptor. Okay, that's basically going to take in the insulin. So imagine the insulin receptor is your door lock. Insulin is the key. Glucose is what's in the bloodstream, and what we're trying to do in order to get it into that cell is we need the door lock to have a key to turn to open up the glucose channel, because it's closed without that channel being turned or opened up. So the insulin enters in, unlocks the glucose channel, and then of course glucose can go into the cells. That's what happens typically. Now, what happens when we get into something called insulin resistance? Okay, because sometimes what happens is abuse of, glucose. In other words, we're eating way too many things, because remember, those processed foods, or sucrose, that white table sugar, is a combination of glucose and fructose. Remember, that's what refined sugar is. It's both. Okay. When we're eating too much glucose, because even the good sugar, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. Never forget that. Just because I'm saying glucose is your good sugar, fructose is your bad sugar, what I'm saying is you should avoid fructose at all costs. I mean, you should try to avoid it as much as you can, because all it's going to do is make you fat. We've established that. But too much glucose can have a similar problem. In fact, it is the reason why we are morbidly obese, and I'm going to show you why. Because we're eating so much of this stuff, and the combination of glucose, there's so much of it in our blood, we become insulin resistant because our cells are so full of glucose, they don't need anymore, can't take in anymore. Imagine that the house is full, the door is locked, and we got chains on it. Okay, now there's only so many insulin receptors or locks that can accept a key. As a result, we have a ton of insulin in our bloodstream that can't go into a receptor, and our glucose is all throughout the blood because guess what? It has no receptor to fall into because we don't have that many available. So what happens to all the excess insulin and excess glucose? Yep, you guessed it. It converts to fat. That's what happens. So another way of looking at this, you eat a high carb diet, okay? Constant high glucose in the blood. Remember what I talked about, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. Remember that high carb diet, when you're talking about processed foods, it's a combination of fructose, glucose. The fructose automatically converts to fat. We know that in some form, fashion, or way. The glucose is being processed, but our body simply can't keep up. You have this constant high insulin demand. The pancreas is on overload. You have insulin cells and glucose receptors becoming resistant. In other words, there's no more room for them. Our starving cells, high glucose level, high insulin levels, that creates hunger cravings. So yes, as we can't process it into the cells, we have these hunger cravings. And guess what? That makes us crave, oh yes, that dopamine stuff, the fructose. So guess what? We go back to eating these processed foods all over again. This is your insulin resistance cycle. What about your sugar addiction cycle? You eat sugar, you like it, you crave it, it has those addictive properties. Remember, sugar is usually related to an addiction or a request for some type of satisfaction or dopamine, the feel-good hormone release. Has nothing to do with hunger. Blood sugar levels spike, dopamine is released. We've talked about that, resulting in that addiction to that dopamine release. And of course, insulin secretion. Blood sugar levels fall rapidly after it basically gets it out. That rapid reduction in sugar levels creates a craving. Those cravings means, hey, we have low blood sugar or low blood insulin, which results in appetite, which means we're going to repeat. Wow. Are we ever going to win this battle? Okay, but you can see why insulin is what's actually making us fat, because we know the fructose is the enemy, but here's the thing, too much glucose is also the problem when you put it in combination with. One of the biggest offenders, though, is our high fructose corn syrup. Okay, this is one of our biggest problems, because remember, it's 55% bad sugar, 45% of the good stuff. But remember, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. What are the worst offenders? Well, here you are. Sugary beverages and snacks. In fact, if we go back to the creation of high fructose corn syrup back in 1970, and we look, at our consumption per capita versus our obesity rates of the population, you can kind of see almost a direct correlation with, as we continue to eat high fructose corn syrup, we continue to get fatter and fatter.